This morning, by popular vote, you have asked me to answer this question. Why don't we hear about Jesus from his birth when he was an adult? There's about a 30-year gap. What kind of teenager do you think that he was? It's a fascinating question. It's actually a whole bunch of related questions all tied up in one. And in some ways, it is an easy question to answer. Why don't we hear anything about the youth of Jesus? Well, it's only natural. Nobody was paying attention. Until Jesus began to make a splash, until he began to do amazing things like heal the sick and tell these incredible stories about the kingdom of God and challenge the authorities, nobody much paid attention. And they just assumed that he was an ordinary, everyday young man. It was only later. And in particular, once a whole movement had grown up around the events of his death and resurrection, that people began to wonder, well, what was his life before he became famous? And this is, in fact, the normal pattern. If you look back through history at some of the greatest figures in history, people like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, it was only later, after they became famous, after they changed the world, and in some cases it was centuries later, that people began to wonder and talk about what their childhood had been like. So it is that we actually have relatively little biographical information about the early life of Jesus. We have, of course, two justly famous stories of his birth, one in the Gospel of Matthew and one in the Gospel of Luke. But they are two very different stories. Oh, they agree on a few very important details, of course, but they tell the story so differently that this really indicates that they are stories that came into the Christian tradition relatively late. And of course, there is one story, only one in the Gospels, of the youth of Jesus. The story we read this morning from the Gospel of Luke, about the time when he was about 12 years old. So in this sense, our question this morning isn't quite correct. There isn't really a 30-year gap. There is one little story in there. But even this story, in many ways, I really think that Luke only included it because he liked the ways in which it anticipated and foretold and foreshadowed everything that Jesus would be as an adult. And so this story teaches us that Jesus will grow up to be a great, great teacher of wisdom, that he will grow up to challenge the authorities, both religious and secular, and that he will be someone who sets as his highest priority his obligation to God, an obligation even greater for Jesus than the all-important obligation to family. So Luke's focus, at least in telling the story and relating it and passing it down to us, is really on who Jesus will be, and not so much on who he was as a child. So it is only of limited use. And that's what we have in the Gospels. Now, there are other stories that have come down through tradition about the childhood of Jesus. In particular, there is a book called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. It was written, it is estimated, around 145 AD. And it includes a number of stories about the childhood of Jesus in Nazareth. One of the most famous stories is the story of Jesus playing as a little boy, making birds out of clay, which he then transformed into living birds who flew away. Then there's another story, a story about how one day Jesus was playing with his playmates in Nazareth, and one of his friends accidentally jostled him. Jesus, in a peak of anger, turned around, cursed his playmate, who shriveled up and died. Not a very inspiring story, I'm afraid. But really, this infancy gospel of Thomas, there's no reason to think that the stories in it go back in any way to genuine traditions of Jesus' childhood. And probably the stories in this book were created in order to satisfy a certain curiosity about the early life of Jesus that developed in the 2nd century. So as I say, we don't have a lot to go on. Just a few little stories. So is there really nothing to say here? Can we not say anything much about the childhood of Jesus? Am I done here? Is this going to be my shortest sermon of the year? Oh, don't get your hopes up. Because there are a few things, some little nuggets of fact that absolutely go back to the heart of the tradition of Jesus as it was originally passed down to the early church, that actually can tell us a great deal about the infancy and childhood of Jesus. This morning we read a story in the Gospel of Matthew about how when Jesus, when he was an adult, went back to his own town and preached to the people there. This little story reminds us of a few facts about Jesus' life that have always been indisputable. First of all, foremost, it reminds us that Jesus was raised in a village called Nazareth in Galilee. That he was raised there by Mary and Joseph, and that Joseph was a carpenter. A few little facts, but facts that we can take to really reconstruct a great deal about the childhood of Jesus. Let's start with Nazareth. Nazareth today is the largest city in the north of Israel. It has today a population of about 200,000 people, most of them Arab Israelis who are either Muslims or Christians. Nazareth today is a major religious center for both Christians and Muslims, and so it is a place where you will find many churches and many different holy sites. And because of the holy sites that occupy some of the most important space within Nazareth, archaeologists have actually been able to engage in a number of digs and have been able to reconstruct what life was like in the 1st century in Nazareth. In particular, excavations have taken place on a large piece of property that belongs to the Franciscan order. So based on these excavations and the studies that have been done, we know that Nazareth looked very different in the 1st century when Jesus was growing up there. Archaeologists estimate that based on what they have been able to find of 1st century Nazareth, that the population during the first half of the 1st century was probably somewhere between 200 and 400 individuals. That's small. It's not a city, certainly not a city. It barely counts as a town. It's really more of a village. They've also been able to find where the houses were in that time, but among those remains of houses, they have found no cut stones, no bricks, which probably indicates that the houses, such as they were constructed of uncut field stones that were held together by mud or manure. Archaeologists have found no roofing tiles or shingles, which indicates that the roofs were probably made out of thatched straw, which have long since, of course, rotted away. Interestingly enough, among the ruins of early 1st century Nazareth, they have found absolutely no imported items. No plates, not a scrap of glass, no imported pottery, no amphorae, which could have contained imported wine, nothing like that. This very clearly indicates that Nazareth in the 1st century was very, very poor. In In fact, poorer than many other locations in first century Galilee. It was basically a small agricultural village. And in that agricultural village, on the south-facing slopes to the north of the village, would have been a fairly decent place to grow grapes and to tread there to make wine. In the valley, where most of the families lived, they would have planted some grain and a few vegetables near the only source of water in the village, a well that was called, or that is called today, the Well of Mary. And on the hills to the south of the village, they would have planted some olive trees. That was it. That was all they had, all that they lived. We also know, based on these excavations, that Nazareth in the first century was very clearly a Jewish village. This is based on the tombs that have been found around the edges of that first century occupation. The tombs are all very clearly Jewish tombs. At that time, Jews did a second burial, where they would reclaim the body after some time and rebury the bones in a box called an ossuary. So very clearly it was a Jewish village. But, and this is really quite interesting, archaeologists have found no evidence whatsoever of any public buildings in Nazareth. Most interesting, no synagogue. They were Jews, but they did not have a synagogue. In fact, archaeologists have found in all of first century Galilee evidence of only one synagogue in the entire region. So that makes us read that passage from Matthew a little bit differently. When it says that Jesus went to Nazareth and spoke in the synagogue, you should not imagine that as Jesus entering a building and speaking to people there. The word synagogue actually means an assembly. And it was only later that assemblies in Galilee took places in buildings. In the first century, assemblies took place in the open air, probably in the village square. That's where Jesus would have spoken. So there you have it. That's where Jesus grew up. That tells us a few things about what his childhood would be. If you were to imagine the childhood of Jesus, you should imagine him living in a place that was really small. 200 to 400 people. Everybody knew everybody else. Everybody was also probably related to everybody else. And there were only 3 or 4 main families in the place. And everybody in Nazareth was a peasant farmer, just getting by on what they could grow on their little fields. Everybody, of course, except for Joseph and for Jesus. Because, of course, we know that they were not farmers. We are told that they were carpenters. And I don't know if you noticed that in our reading this morning, but being a carpenter in Nazareth wasn't a very good thing. The people in Nazareth, as soon as they remembered that Jesus was the son of Joseph the carpenter, as soon as they identified him in the parallel passage in the Gospel of Mark as a carpenter himself, they immediately rejected him and did not want to listen to him. Now think about what that means. He was looked down upon by peasants. Now this is confusing, of course, because we tend to think of a carpenter as a skilled artisan, someone who's able to do fairly well in this world, at least if he applies himself. Why would anyone look down on a carpenter? Well, we need to understand the word that is used for carpenter in the New Testament does not mean what the word means for us today. A carpenter, the word doesn't even refer to someone who necessarily works with wood. It is actually a general term that was used for any sort of laborer, an unskilled laborer, who worked on building sites with wood and stone and other materials. So a carpenter in first century Galilee was fairly low in terms of status. Yes, he was maybe a little better off than a slave, a little better off than a day laborer working on farms, but that's about it. And in terms of status, he would have ranked below the vast majority of people in Nazareth who were peasant farmers, because at least they had a bit of land. Now this immediately raises the question, what is a carpenter doing living in a little village like Nazareth? I mean, how on earth could a carpenter, an unskilled laborer on building sites, make a living in a little place like that? How did they survive? Well, it turns out that there is one thing about Nazareth that would attract a carpenter, that might explain why, as Matthew says in his Gospels, Joseph chose to settle in Nazareth. Because Nazareth was about 6 kilometers south of the city of Sepphoris. And Sepphoris was, during those years when Jesus was growing up, the capital city of Galilee. And Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee, all through those years when Jesus was growing up, was building up his capital city of Galilee, capital city, Sepphoris. So during those years, there would have been constant building projects going on in Sepphoris. So it's not all that hard to imagine Joseph, and years later, Jesus himself, making that hour or so long trek down the road to work in Sepphoris on building sites for little bits of money for days at a time. That's probably how they survived. Joseph did it, and then later Jesus did it himself. This means, of course, that when Jesus was growing up, when he was a young child, he probably had an absent father. Joseph was gone for long stretches of time. How did he deal with that? I can't help but feel that maybe this idea that Jesus had within him, this idea that he had another father, a father in heaven who would look after him and give him what he needed if he trusted him, was one of those things that sustained Jesus through some tough days. So based on these few little details about where Jesus grew up, what his parents did, we can put together a few little facts, important facts, about the childhood of Jesus. First of all, it seems absolutely indisputable that Jesus grew up in utter poverty. He just managed to get by. His family just managed to get by. Little wonder then that Jesus grew up to have great sympathy for the poor of Galilee and Judea, that he would declare that they were blessed by God, and that the kingdom of God belonged to them. Jesus grew up, it seems, with an absent father figure. Joseph was gone for long stretches of time. Little wonder then that he grew up to believe that he had another father, a father in heaven who looked after him. It was a radical idea for the time, an idea that Jesus preached and that truly did transform the world and a new understanding of God. Jesus, though he himself was not a farmer, though his father was not a farmer, Jesus grew up very much in an agricultural village. Everybody he knew, except for his immediate family, worked the land. It's not a great surprise, therefore, that Jesus grew up to tell some amazing stories about the kingdom of God that all began with things like a farmer went out to sow some seed, or a man planted seed in the ground. Another thing that is indisputable about his childhood in Nazareth, Jesus clearly grew up deeply steeped in the traditions and the stories of the Jewish faith. Hearing again and again the stories of the heroes, the prophets, and what they did, and how they challenged the authorities of their day. And these stories, I think more than anything else, nourished the man that he would become. If you had seen Jesus when he was 11 years old, say, what would you have seen? I have no doubt that you would have seen a very bright, intelligent boy, a boy who had a habit of saying very profound things. But I also suspect that you would have seen an ordinary boy, one who dealt with the same things that all the other people around him, one who struggled with the same things as everyone else around him. The thing that set Jesus apart eventually was a sense of calling, that he had been called by God to do something unique in this world. What set him apart was an understanding of a unique relationship that he had with his Father in heaven. If you had seen him at that age, would you have recognized him as the Son of God, as the Messiah, the one who would change the world in so many ways? Probably not. But in a very real way, who Jesus was at 11 and at 16 was the same as who he would be at 30. One who would come with a deep understanding of what it meant to be human, what it meant to struggle with things in this world. But one who would also be able to demonstrate in real and practical ways what the face and the love of God looks like to this world. Let's take a few moments in silence.